Hey, tonight we're diving into the lost biographies of Amazonian tribal leaders, not the mystical, romanticized jungle tales you've seen in glossy documentaries, but the quiet, often forgotten truths buried in humid river villages and dense, unbroken forests. These were not just warriors or chiefs, but parents, storytellers, and keepers of a history that rarely made it to paper. You might think you know the Amazon, but trust me, the real stories are slower, stranger, and far more human than you've ever imagined. And before we start, drop your name and city in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's listening from. The air in the upper reaches of the Rio Negro moved like warm syrup, thick, heavy, carrying with it the smell of damp leaves and river mud. Morning light here was never sharp. It sifted down through layers of mist and green canopy, breaking into 1,000 soft beams that painted the water in muted golds. You could hear life long before you saw it, the slow drip of water from high branches, the creak of unseen frogs, and somewhere far upriver, the steady rhythm of a paddle striking the surface. Along one of the narrower bends, a small village stood, half on land, half on stilts, above the brown water. Its houses were simple woven palm walls, thatched roofs darkened by decades of rain, and wooden walkways that swayed gently with each footstep. The people here moved without hurry. Even greetings took their time, unfolding in long exchanges that asked about family, health, and the river's mood before any other topic could be touched. This was the birthplace of Amaru, a man whose name never made it into school textbooks or foreign histories. In the memory of his people, however, he was more than a leader. He was a living thread that tied the past to the present. He knew the taste of every plant that grew within a day's walk of the village, could read the wind by the rustle of leaves, and could tell you the history of each bend in the river as if it were a chapter in a book. Amaru's earliest memories were of the river at dawn, the way the mist clung to its surface like a second skin, the soft hiss as paddles sliced through it, and the faint scent of wood smoke curling from cooking fires on shore. His grandmother Yara would wrap him in a woven cotton shawl and carry him to the water's edge before the sun broke fully over the treetops. She said that a child needed to hear the river's first song of the day, for it was the time when the spirits were still half dreaming, and their voices could be heard if you listened closely. Yara herself was a figure of quiet authority. Her hair, long and silver, was always braided with threads dyed in the deep reds and browns of crushed seeds. She had seen seasons of flood and drought, years when the fish came in such numbers that the river seemed to shimmer with silver, and years when even the best fishermen returned with empty baskets. In her voice was the weight of stories that stretched beyond memory, tales of ancestors who had navigated these same waters when the world beyond the forest was nothing but rumor. Amaru's father, Irie, was known for his skill with the paddle. He could guide a narrow canoe through the tightest mangrove passages without disturbing a single bird from its perch. His hands were broad and calloused, the skin darkened not only by the sun but by the long hours spent working in the fields and repairing fishing nets. He believed that the measure of a person was found in their patience, and patience was a skill he passed to his son, not through lectures, but through the unhurried rhythm of their days together. The boy learned to weave small traps from palm fibers before he could read the carvings on the old wooden poles that marked the village boundaries. These poles, half sunk into the soft earth, were more than simple markers. Each was carved with symbols that told a fragment of the people's journey. A flood survived, a rival tribe befriended, a great storm endured. Whenever Amaru asked about them, Yara would smile faintly and say, "These are not stories to be rushed, child. The river's current will take you to them in time." When the rains came heavy, unbroken days when the sky seemed to tip endlessly into the earth, the village became an island. Canoes were tied to doorways, and the walkways between houses vanished beneath the rising water. Life did not stop, it merely shifted. Children learned to swim before they could walk far, and the sounds of laughter often drifted across the flooded lanes as they played games with floating seeds and carved wooden toys. Inside the homes, the air was thick with the smell of drying fish, boiling roots, and the faint tang of smoke from the cooking fires that never went out, even in the wettest months. At night, when the rains eased to a steady murmur, Amaru would lie awake, listening to the forest breathe. The deep croak of frogs, the click of insects, and the distant, mournful call of night birds filled the darkness. Yara's voice would rise, softly from her mat in the corner, telling stories that wandered slowly, like the river itself, stories with no clear beginning and no need for an ending, meant not to teach a single lesson, but to remind the listener that all things, like the river's flow, were connected. There was one story she returned to often, the tale of the white heron. It spoke of a time when the river had nearly lost its voice, its waters trapped by fallen trees after a storm. The animals had gathered in confusion, unable to follow their usual paths. It was the white heron who flew upstream to find the blockage and called upon the wind to lift the trees away. In return, the river promised to carry the heron's reflection for as long as it flowed. To Yara, this was not just a story about a bird and a river. It was a reminder that every being had its part to play in keeping the world in balance. By the time Amaru reached his 10th year, he could paddle alone as far as the bend where the old kapok tree stood, a massive giant, whose roots plunged into the river like the legs of some ancient beast. Its trunk was scarred by generations of carvings, some so weathered that they were little more than ghostly impressions in the bark. Villagers believed the tree listened to those who spoke to it and remembered their words in its rings. Amaru never doubted it. When he placed his hand on the rough surface, he felt the same quiet hum he sensed when listening to the river at dawn. It was around this age that he began to notice the subtle changes in the river's moods. Some mornings it greeted the canoes with an easy current, carrying them along with little effort. Other days it seemed to resist every stroke, as if testing the determination of those who traveled it. And then there were the rare times when the water lay still and mirror-like, holding its breath as though it knew something was about to change. Yara said, these were days to move carefully, for the world was listening more closely than usual. Amaru's world was small in distance, but endless in detail. A single morning's journey could bring him past orchids that bloomed only once a year, trees where parrots gathered in noisy clouds, and quiet inlets where the water was so clear he could see the slow sway of fishtails far below. To an outsider, it might have seemed like nothing ever happened here, but Amaru knew that every shift of light, every ripple of water, and every bird call told its own small story. It was in these years before the weight of leadership, before the journeys beyond the village, that Amaru learned the art of paying attention, not the hurried noticing of travelers passing through, but the deep, patient watching of someone who understands that the world reveals itself only when it chooses, and never all at once. The elders of these river communities often sat in low, smoke-darkened huts, their knees drawn up, fingers tracing invisible patterns in the dirt as they spoke. Their voices were slow, not out of frailty, but because words here carried weight. A single pause could stretch into the hum of cicadas, the distant splash of a fish breaking the water's skin. These pauses were not awkward. They were the way memory breathed. When an elder began to recall a leader's life, it rarely started with a birth date or a heroic battle. Instead, it might begin with the texture of the rain that fell the night that leader was born, how it slid off palm leaves in heavy sheets, how the clay paths became slick and deep, how the smell of wet wood smoke hung over the village. In their telling, a leader's story was inseparable from the river's moods. The migration of birds, or the first fruit to ripen that year. The Amazon was not kind to those who hurried. Here, time was layered like the soft rings inside a felled tree, invisible until someone patiently cut deep enough to see. And so, these biographies unfolded slowly, often over several evenings. A listener might spend the first night hearing only of the leader's childhood laughter, the exact shade of mud on their ankles as they chased frogs, the names of the women who plaited their hair. Another evening might bring the story of their first canoe, carved from a cedar tree, with patience and respect, never rushed for the sake of the task. Some leaders were remembered not for grand victories, but for the subtle ways they shaped their people's days. One might have been the first to teach children to whistle a certain bird call, ensuring the sound was never lost to the forest. Another might have kept a secret garden of medicinal plants on a hidden bank of the river, tending it alone in the misty dawn hours before the village stirred. What was striking was how little these accounts resembled the tidy narratives outsiders expected. There were no sharp beginnings and clean endings, no single moment where a leader became important. Instead, their lives were woven into countless small gestures. The way they shared the fattest fish at a communal meal, the way they could name the stars that only appeared in the wet season, the way they knew when the river would rise before anyone else saw the signs. For those who sat and listened, these stories were not just about the person, but about the Amazon itself, a reminder that here, no life could be separated from the water, the heat, and the deep, breathing green. The leaders were the river, and the river was them. Life along the Amazon's many tributaries did not move at the pace of outsiders' maps or explorers' journals. Instead, it followed the rhythm of the river's moods. In the dry months, the water would draw back, revealing strips of cracked mud and pale sandbars, where children played and elders sat mending woven fish traps. In the wet months, the river would swell so quietly and persistently that entire villages seemed to float without ever leaving their foundations. For the leaders of these small communities, leaders who were not always elected but often simply trusted into their role, each day's work was made up of decisions so subtle that an outsider might not recognize them as leadership at all. Choosing when to plant cassava, based on the texture of the soil beneath bare feet. Deciding whether to send a hunting party upriver or downriver after noticing the faint change in bird calls at dawn. Calling for a night of communal storytelling, when tempers in the village had grown tight after a long season of rain. These leaders rarely lived apart from their people. Their houses were often only slightly larger than the rest, perhaps with a few more woven mats, or a slightly taller roof to allow in more light. It was their seat in the evening fire circle, a place everyone knew without needing to point, that marked them as the one whose voice carried quiet authority. And even then, that authority could not be enforced by any written law or external force. It was kept alive by trust, by a long memory of fairness, and by the leader's ability to listen more than speak. Many kept their biographies not in books, but in the memories of others. A life was recorded in the way a certain style of basket weaving would be remembered as her pattern, or a particular curing chant would be recognized as his song. These were fragments of history that could not be taken down in neat paragraphs, but lived in the hands and voices of those who had known them. Outsiders who came with notebooks and ink often overlooked these details. They might write down the number of households or the location of a village, but they would miss the way a leader's morning began with a slow walk to the edge of the water to greet the river, as if it were an elder itself. They would note the use of spears or blowpipes in hunting, but not the gentle conversations about the dreams people had the night before. Conversations that could shape whether a journey was taken at all. It is in these small, nearly invisible acts that the true biographies of Amazonian tribal leaders live. Not in grand battles or dramatic speeches, but in a lifetime of tiny decisions, repeated with patience, shaped by the seasons and the river's endless rise and fall. Their stories do not announce themselves. They settle around you slowly, like mist, until you realize you've been breathing them in the whole time. The heart of these river communities was never in their weapons or their hunting trophies, but in the way they prepared for the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. Life along the wide brown rivers moved at a rhythm dictated by tides and moonlight, and the homes raised on stilts above the waterline were as much a part of the forest as the towering kapok trees that loomed overhead. In the evenings, as the air thickened with the scent of wet earth and crushed leaves. Families would gather in the open-air platforms, their hammocks swaying gently, to exchange the smallest of news: who had spotted an unusual bird upstream, who had mended a fishing net without losing a knot, who had heard the faint drumming of another village far downriver. These were the hours when the elders became historians. Without written language or carved records, every detail of the past had to be spoken into memory layer upon layer of stories, each carrying the weight of seasons and generations. You might hear about a flood so great it carried whole fruit trees away, or about the time when river dolphins guided a lost canoe back to the safety of shore. The children, fighting the pull of sleep, would press their ears to the voices of grandparents, knowing these stories would one day be their responsibility to tell. Daily survival here was not about conquest, but cooperation. The dense canopy overhead wasn't just shaded, was a living larder, offering fruits that ripened in cycles no calendar could track, and branches where medicinal vines twined around the trunks. Every plant, every sound of bird or insect carried meaning. The call of a certain frog might signal incoming rain before the clouds even gathered. A pattern of ripples on the water might reveal the slow approach of a manatee, or warn of the lean watchful eyes of a caiman. And yet, despite the beauty and abundance, there was always a kind of unspoken fragility. A season of too much rain could sweep away fishing traps. Too little, and the banks cracked, the shallows shrank, and the water grew warm enough to drive fish downstream. These moments tested the resourcefulness of the leaders not through speeches or war cries, but through the patient, unseen work of keeping the village's rhythm in step with the land's unpredictable pulse. At night, when the last fire's embers dimmed, the forest took over. The soft clicking of beetles, the long rising call of night birds, the distant splash of something large shifting in the black water, it all became a kind of lullaby. In these sounds, the tribal leaders heard both the comfort of continuity and the warning of change. And as they drifted to sleep in the warm, damp air, they knew that their legacy would not be built on monuments, but in the way they had kept their people in harmony with the river, the trees, and the unseen paths of the wind. In many of these riverside villages, time moved with a patience that outsiders often found unsettling. A whole afternoon could pass without a single interruption, save for the slow drift of a fishing canoe or the rustle of wind against the palm-thatched roofs. For the elders, these unhurried hours were not wasted. They were opportunities to notice the smallest changes in the land and water. A sudden silence in the canopy might mean a storm brewing miles away. A deeper hue in the river could signal the turning of the season, or the arrival of a migration that would bring food in abundance. Leaders here were rarely the loudest voices. Instead, their influence came from their ability to recall the right story at the right moment, to settle a dispute with a memory, or to guide a decision using the lessons left behind by ancestors. These were not decisions made in council halls or under banners. They were made while mending nets, carving paddles, or walking along narrow paths cut through the undergrowth. It was not uncommon for a chief to spend days moving quietly between homes, speaking to people one at a time, rather than delivering grand speeches. They would ask about a child's fever, check on the repair of a roof, or ensure that a newly married couple had enough tools to build their own cooking shelter. Authority was not measured in wealth or weapons, but in how deeply one's presence was felt across the community. And yet, beyond these acts of care, there was a constant work of remembering, not just for the sake of history, but for survival. Floods could sweep through a village without warning, reshaping the land overnight. A wrong decision about planting or fishing could mean months of hardship. In such moments, the old songs, the oral maps of river bends, and the knowledge of when the waters would rise or retreat became as important as any blade or spear. Leaders were living libraries, each carrying decades of small, precise details that would never be written down, but would guide 100 choices in the years to come. As the sun set, the village would gather in a loose circle near the fire, where smoke curled upward and was swallowed by the dark canopy. The leader might sit slightly apart at first, letting the younger voices speak, laughing softly at a story about a stubborn canoe or a mischievous child. Only when the moment felt right would they begin to speak, and the whole group would quiet, not because they were commanded, but because they understood that these words were rare and worth keeping. In the flicker of that firelight, the history of the Amazon was not a grand myth, but a living, breathing presence, as real as the river's current just beyond the edge of the village. The deeper you move into the Amazon, the more you realize how distance is measured not in miles, but in the rhythm of the river and the slowness of the current. Villages appear and disappear like passing clouds, some little more than a few huts strung together along a muddy bank, others built on stilts to rise above the seasonal floods. In these places, stories live longer than buildings. A name may fade from memory in a city within a generation, but here, a name is kept alive in lullabies, in carvings on canoe paddles, in the way someone plants their cassava, exactly as their grandmother taught them. The tribal leaders whose lives we'll explore tonight were shaped as much by silence as by action. In the outside world, leadership is often measured by speeches, negotiations, or recorded events. Here, it was measured in who knew which tree would flower early, who could calm a quarrel between two stubborn hunters, who remembered which bend in the river hid the bitter fish that could not be eaten. These were not feats for applause. They were the small, essential acts that kept a community breathing. Many of these leaders never saw a map of the land they ruled. They carried their world in memory, the trail where the roots always tripped, the unwary, the sound of the night when the rains were still 2 days away, the particular way the wind shifted before the river began to rise. Some could trace their lineage back a dozen generations without once looking at paper, reciting names in a cadence that made them part poem, part history, part prayer. What strikes you first, if you ever get the chance to listen, is how little these people speak about themselves. Ask an elder about their childhood, and they will tell you instead about the animals that roamed then, the way the soil felt after the flood season, the games children played before plastic toys arrived. Their own life becomes a frame for something larger: the land, the water, the unbroken forest canopy overhead. It is a kind of humility almost invisible to outsiders, who often mistake it for shyness. But their leadership was never passive. When the forest threatened to take too much, when vines crept into the yam gardens, when the river shifted its course and ate away at the bank, these leaders decided what to do, not by command, but by quiet consensus, built over hours of talk in the shade of a thatched roof, with dogs sleeping at their feet and the smoke of cooking fires curling upward. And then there is the weight of history, though not in the way we think of history. To them, it was not a straight line of dates and events, but a great woven mat, every thread a life, every life a story. Step carelessly, and you could tear it. Tend it with care, and it would hold the community together long after the elders themselves were gone. As twilight deepened, the town of Brackenford seemed to exhale a kind of quiet relief. The last carts of the day had trundled through the market square, leaving behind only faint wheel tracks in the dirt and a few sprigs of straw that caught in the cobblestones. A thin plume of smoke curled from the chimney of the baker's shop, carrying the faint sweet scent of crusts browning in the oven. This was the hour when the village shifted from its outward busyness into its inward rhythms, when shutters were drawn, hearths were stoked, and people began the slow, habitual preparations for bed. For the ordinary folk here, sleep was not a single moment, but a series of gentle steps. The oil lamp would be trimmed, its wick adjusted, so that the flame glowed steady but not wastefully bright. The coals in the kitchen hearth would be banked, not extinguished, so that a faint warmth lingered through the night. In some houses, the floorboards would creak as children padded barefoot from one room to another, carrying small wool blankets, or seeking a final drink of water before being ushered back to bed. The air at this time of year, late autumn, had a particular quality to it, a thin, almost metallic chill that seeped in from the eaves and through the tiny cracks in window frames. This was why bed warming practices were so central to nightly life. In the grander houses, a servant might already be upstairs with a brass warming pan filled with embers, sliding it gently between the cold linen sheets so that by the time the master retired, the bed would no longer bite with frost. In humbler homes, people relied on more makeshift methods, a hot stone wrapped in cloth, placed at the foot of the bed, or a ceramic bottle filled with boiled water, tucked near the toes. As the light faded entirely, sounds took on a different texture. The muffled laughter of a neighbor could be heard faintly through the wall. Somewhere, a cow gave a low, restless moan in its stall. The wind began to worry at the loose latch on a garden gate, setting it to knocking at intervals. All these things became part of the night's slow soundtrack, and for many, they were comforting in their familiarity. In households where books were rare but storytelling was rich, this was the time when an elder might sit at the edge of the hearth and begin recounting a familiar tale. The stories themselves, whether of old kings, curious travelers, or small moral lessons, were often told in the same words, year after year, so that listeners could almost anticipate each turn of phrase. The effect was not unlike a lullaby, something steady, reliable, and warmly predictable. Outside, frost was beginning to gather on the thatched roofs, turning the tips of the straw a pale, silvery white. The moon had risen quietly, casting a faint glow over the hedgerows and cobbled lanes. Soon, the entire town would settle into the deep, collective breathing of sleep. And yet, in that liminal time between wakefulness and slumber, there was a peculiar richness and unhurried layering of scents, sounds, and half-formed thoughts that made the closing of each day feel like a small ceremony in itself. The early decades of the 18th century were a time when the rhythm of the night was just as important as the rhythm of the day. In the villages and small towns scattered across the countryside, people measured their lives by candlelight and the slow, familiar cycles of chores, meals, and rest. The sun's departure was not merely an end to daylight. Tea was a signal for the home to transform into a quieter, more intimate world, where every sound carried more weight, and every flicker of light was noticed. Before sleep came preparation, and preparation was rarely hurried. The act of making one's bed was itself a small ritual. Layers of coarse linen sheets, wool blankets, and, in many cases, a patched quilt that had been repaired so often it carried the history of decades in its stitches. Families would pull their bedding close to the fire in the evening to warm it, letting the heat sink into the fabric before it was carried back to the sleeping area. Those without a good hearth fire might rely instead on a bed warmer, a long-handled brass or copper pan filled with embers, slid carefully between the sheets to take away the chill. In homes where children slept several to a bed, body warmth became the most reliable source of heat through the long winter nights. Nighttime itself carried its own set of quiet labors. The last bucket of water would be drawn before the well froze over. The final embers would be stirred and banked to keep a small core of heat alive until morning. Doors were bolted, shutters fastened, and in some places, a cloth was hung over gaps in the walls or windows to keep out the drafts. While these tasks may have seemed mundane, their repetition provided reassurance. Each action, a silent promise that the home would hold against the cold and the dark. Light was precious in these hours. Candles were expensive, so they were often used sparingly, their flames shielded by horn lanterns or glass to protect from sudden gusts. Tallow candles gave a smoky, slightly acrid scent, while beeswax ones burned more cleanly, reserved for those who could afford such a luxury, or for special occasions. Oil lamps, filled with whale oil, linseed, or other available fuels, offered another option, though they too were often lit only in the main room where the family gathered. Evenings were not always silent. In homes where spinning wheels and small looms were tucked in the corners, women might continue working wool or flax by firelight, their hands moving almost without conscious thought. Men, if not mending tools or patching boots, might carve small objects from wood, the shavings curling to the floor, and always there was conversation soft-spoken, to match the intimacy of the hour. Stories were told, not just to entertain, but to pass on memory and lessons. Folk tales of long winters past, of ancestors who endured harsher conditions, of strange happenings in the forest. These helped to knit the community's identity together. Beyond the walls of the home, the night air seemed to deepen the stillness of the countryside. The distant bark of a dog, the faint toll of a church bell marking the hour, the rustle of a thatched roof under wind. Such sounds reminded those awake that the world outside remained alive, even in darkness. In certain months, the pale wash of moonlight over snow lent the village an almost otherworldly glow, making familiar shapes seem strange and new. In some towns, watchmen made slow rounds through the streets, calling out the hours in steady, reassuring voices. They carried lanterns that threw small, warm pools of light onto the cobblestones, their presence both practical and symbolic, keepers of order and safety in the hours when most people slept. Occasionally, they would stop to check a gate, adjust a loose shutter, or investigate the source of an unfamiliar noise. Sleep, when it came, was not always a single, unbroken stretch. In many households, it was common to experience a first sleep and a second sleep, divided by a quiet waking period in the middle of the night. This was a time for small, private activities, tending to the fire, saying prayers, even visiting neighbors under moonlight. For some, it was an opportunity for quiet thought or quiet work, when the mind felt sharper and the world outside lay undisturbed. And so the night, with all its rituals, was as much a part of life as the day. It was a time shaped by necessity and by custom, a slow, deliberate passage toward rest. In these long hours, the smallest comforts, a warmed bed, a steady flame, the sound of a familiar voice, could transform the cold and the dark into something safe, even cherished. As winter's grip loosened only slightly, the villagers began to notice subtle shifts in the rhythm of their days. The light lingered a few breaths longer in the evenings, casting a softer gold upon the frozen ruts of the main road. Yet the air still held the faint bitterness of frost, and the breath of every passerby rose like ghostly ribbons into the pale sky. Outside the baker's shop, a slow queue formed each morning, boots scraping the packed snow as neighbors traded subdued greetings. The warmth within was not only from the ovens, but from the lingering scent of spiced loaves, made richer with whatever dried fruits could still be spared from the winter stores. Children, restless from too many days indoors, found reasons to wander along the edges of the frozen stream, testing the ice with sticks and listening to the satisfying crackle beneath. They would dash away laughing when a patch gave a sudden hollow sound, pretending danger where there was only a shallow layer of meltwater. The older folk shook their heads at this energy, but secretly, many took comfort in the sound of youthful voices returning to the lanes after months of quiet. In the workshop near the square, the carpenter's bench was strewn with thin curls of wood, pale against the dark, worn planks. He had begun shaping new handles for tools that would soon see the soil again, though the ground was still iron. His slow, methodical movements seemed in no hurry for the each stroke of the plane, accompanied by the faint rasp of iron on grain. Outside his door, a half-mended cart stood waiting, its wheel propped at an angle, spokes replaced one by one with patience, born of long winters. By the inn, a low fire was kept constantly alive, its embers banked carefully under ash. Here, travelers paused before continuing on to the next village, stamping snow from their boots and accepting mugs of dark, steaming broth. The talk was rarely urgent. It wound lazily from tales of good harvests past to speculation about the coming spring fairs. Even disagreement seemed softened in the dim firelight, as though no one wished to disturb the slow, steady passage of the season. Along the outer fields, fences half buried in drifts marked boundaries that, in this weather, hardly mattered. A pair of crows, black against the pale expanse, hopped and tilted their heads in search of scraps. Beyond them, the hills rose in smooth white curves, the wind's work smoothing away any trace of the paths and footfalls that crisscrossed them in summer. Somewhere in the distance, a woodcutter's axe struck with a steady rhythm, the sound carrying clear in the cold stillness edge below, a reminder that life, though slowed, had not paused entirely. Beyond the hum of ordinary routines, there was a certain rhythm to life in those early hours before the main work of the day began. The faint sound of a creaking bucket handle could be heard as one of the older women, wrapped in a shawl worn thin at the elbows, drew water from the community. Well, the rope, rough with age, rasped against the wood, releasing a faint smell of damp hemp that carried in the cool, morning air. She worked unhurriedly, her motions steady, for she had learned over many winters that haste brought no reward, only spills and unnecessary wear on one's hands. The water, once hoisted, reflected the pale light in shifting ripples, as though holding a quiet conversation with the sky above. In another corner of the lane, a boy no older than 10 knelt to polish the brass clasps of a wooden chest his family used to store winter bedding. His work was not so much about necessity as it was about pride. Even the smallest objects seemed worth preserving in that place where nothing was easily replaced. As his fingers worked the cloth over the metal, the cold stung his knuckles, turning them pink, but the sheen that gradually emerged was reward enough. Along the narrow path, toward the outskirts, a cart creaked under the weight of firewood. It was pulled not by a horse, as one might expect, but by 2 stout oxen, their breath visible in the crisp air. The man leading them, tall and wearing a cap of thickly woven wool, moved with the deliberate pace of one accustomed to measuring his energy for the day ahead. The logs in his cart were not merely fuel, they were hours of warmth yet to be enjoyed, moments of relief from the biting cold. Near the stone wall that separated the houses from the frozen meadow, 2 neighbors stood speaking in low voices. One held a clay jug close to his chest, while the other clutched a bundle wrapped in linen. The details of their exchange were private, though the occasional nod or raised eyebrow hinted at matters of shared concern, perhaps about the shifting price of grain, or the condition of the road after last night's frost. Such quiet conversations, never recorded in any ledger, were the invisible threads that bound the community together. A faint plume of wood smoke began to rise from one of the chimneys, curling into the pale morning like ink dissolving in water. Its scent, both sharp and comforting, signaled that breakfast fires were being lit. The smell carried hints of yesterday's embers, now coaxed back to life, mingling with the faint aroma of bread dough left to rise overnight. And in the background of it all, the steady tick of unseen time moved forward, not in the brisk fashion of a city clock, but in the slower, softer way of places, where each day was much like the one before, and each season followed the same familiar path. While bed warmers and heavy quilts formed the central comforts of nighttime in the 18th century, warmth itself was not confined to the bed. The entire rhythm of a household, from the way floors were covered to the arrangement of seating in common rooms, was influenced by the desire to trap and preserve heat during the cold months. Homes of the period, particularly those in the colder reaches of Europe, were arranged with deliberate thought to where warmth was generated and how it could be kept from escaping. In small cottages, the hearth was both the source of cooking and the primary heating device, and the closer one's sleeping space was to the fire, the better the night's rest. Some families adopted the custom of moving their beds nearer to the kitchen in the winter months, or even sleeping in the same room as the hearth. This practice was common among rural dwellers who had little separation between living and cooking spaces, but it also found its way into modest urban homes where the expense of heating multiple rooms was prohibitive. Curtains were not only hung at windows but often draped around beds themselves, creating what was called a bed tent, a sort of miniature room within a room that trapped the occupant's body heat and blocked drafts from ill-fitted shutters. These curtains could be plain wool in poorer homes or richly embroidered in wealthier households, sometimes lined with an extra layer of flannel for additional insulation. Even the materials of the floors contributed to nightly comfort. Stone floors, so common in older houses, were notoriously cold underfoot, so people layered them with woven rush mats in summer and with thick woolen rugs in winter. In some places, straw was spread directly onto the floor as a temporary insulating layer. Walking barefoot across such a floor in January could be an unpleasant shock, so socks, knitted slippers, or felted overshoes became essential bedtime attire. Children especially were bundled in knitted nightcaps and mitten-like hand coverings to prevent the restless tossing that often left blankets in a heap at the foot of the bed. In larger houses, the use of warming rooms, small enclosed spaces with a continuous fire, was a mark of both comfort and status. Here, family members might gather before retiring to bed, letting the warmth soak into their clothes before making the brisk walk to their sleeping quarters. In monasteries and some public inns, such rooms were a central feature, doubling as spaces for quiet conversation or prayer in the colder hours of the night. For travelers, especially, the memory of stepping from a frost-covered road into a dimly lit warming room was a comfort worth the price of lodging. There was also a deep understanding of how to use the day's warmth to prepare for the night. Windows were opened during rare sunny winter afternoons to let in whatever heat the low sun could offer, and shutters were quickly closed before dusk to trap it inside. Even the placement of furniture was strategic. Beds positioned along interior walls, away from exterior stonework, retained warmth far better. In small bedrooms, every object seemed to play a role in keeping cold air at bay. From the heavy tapestries on the walls to the large trunks pushed against the drafty corners, these nightly preparations for warmth extended beyond physical comfort. They were part of the evening ritual, the slowing down of the household, the small, habitual acts that signaled the day was ending. A mother might stoke the fire and fill a bed warmer for her children while her husband latched the shutters. A grandmother might settle into a low chair to knit yet another pair of woolen stockings, the quiet click of her needles accompanying the muted crackle of the fire. The air grew softer, the lamplight steadier, and the day's noise faded into the hush of the hours before bed. As dusk settled over the village, the faintest chill began to creep along the flagstone floors of the smaller cottages. Those who had spent the day working in the open air welcomed the warmth of their hearths, but it was already clear to them that the fire alone would not be enough to keep the deeper cold from the bedding once night had fully taken hold. In such moments, the use of bed warmers was not merely a small luxury. It was a careful preparation, almost a ritual in its own right. The more cautious households took their time with it. A warming pan, if handled too quickly, could scorch the bed linens or leave an unpleasant, acrid scent in the chamber. The embers used had to be chosen with care, never too bright, never too prone to sparking. A pan loaded hastily with burning fuel could leave a faint constellation of holes in a wool blanket, something that could not be easily mended in a season when textiles were precious. Thus, many took a deliberate, almost ceremonial approach. Some would place the metal pan near the hearth for several minutes before use, allowing it to absorb a gentle heat before even opening the lid to receive its load of embers. A small brass scoop or iron tongs might be used to select only the most suitable coals, their outer ash layer intact, ensuring they would radiate steadily rather than flare. These were then sealed within the pan, which was carried with both hands. the handle wrapped in a cloth to avoid the sudden bite of heat that could travel down the metal shaft. The process of moving it about the bed was slow, patient work. The warming pan was slid under the covers and drawn in long, measured passes from the foot of the bed toward the head, its rounded lid clinking softly against the mattress frame at each turn. The faint metallic creak of the hinge became a familiar household sound in wintertime, often heard in quiet rhythm with the crackle of the hearth. It was not uncommon for a child, already dressed for bed, to follow the pan's path with expectant eyes, their toes curling in anticipation of the moment they would slip into sheets holding the day's last captured warmth. In larger homes, the warming was often performed by a servant or younger family member, while the head of the household might sit nearby reading or mending. In smaller dwellings, it was a shared task. The pan passed between hands, each person taking a turn at ensuring the bedding was evenly heated. In both cases, the act carried with it a sense of seasonal togetherness, the awareness that for all its chill, the cold drew people closer in small, practical ways. Some, lacking a formal warming pan, made use of simpler means, a brick or flat stone heated in the hearth, and then wrapped tightly in cloth before being placed at the foot of the bed. This method lacked the even sweep of the metal pan, but was nonetheless effective and much less expensive. Such bricks might be reused night after night, their surfaces worn smooth over years of service. In especially frugal households, even the ashes from the day's cooking fire could be repurposed, packed into a cloth pouch, and used as a makeshift heat source. The choice of material for the bedding itself also played a role in how well the warmth was retained. Feather-filled quilts held heat most generously, though they were beyond the means of many. Wool, with its natural density, was far more common and, when layered thickly, could trap the bed's warmth for several hours after the pan had done its work. Linen sheets, though cooler to the touch at first, softened with age and allowed the heat to seep through in a gentle, lingering way. And when the bed was finally ready, the coals returned to the hearth. The warming pan propped by the wall for its next use, there came that quiet, almost sacred moment, the slipping beneath covers already tinged with heat, the exhale that marked the end of the day's labors, and the subtle satisfaction of knowing that for the next several hours, the cold would remain at bay. The further one stepped into the heart of the settlement, the more apparent it became how deeply the rhythms of daily life were interwoven with the habits of the seasons and the quiet endurance of tradition. Here, winter was not regarded as a battle to be won, but a slow, deliberate companion one that tested patience, rewarded preparation, and whispered reminders of years gone by. Along the narrow lanes, wood smoke curled lazily from squat chimneys, rising into the pale air before dissolving against the low winter sky. The smell of burning alder and birch lingered like an invisible thread tying every household together, an unspoken reassurance that warmth was never too far away. Windows, paned with uneven glass that warped the light, glowed with the muted gold of tallow candles, their flames trembling slightly whenever a door was opened to admit a returning figure from the cold. On the main track leading toward the market square, footfalls were muffled under a thin crust of snow, broken only by the occasional crunch of a wheel or the soft thud of a boot sinking deeper into the powder. People passed one another with quiet nods, the brevity of their greetings shaped less by indifference and more by the unspoken understanding that long exchanges were best reserved for warmer interiors. A shared glance or a short word was enough, small acknowledgments carrying as much weight as lengthy conversation. Inside the workshops, the steady clatter of work persisted, each trade adapting to the season's limitations. The cobbler worked with a heavier waxed thread to stitch boots strong enough to withstand the damp, while the carpenter, unable to saw planks outdoors, had set up his bench closer to the hearth, the resin in the wood releasing a faintly sweet scent as he worked. In a corner, an apprentice scraped and shaped handles for shovels and sled runners. His sleeves rolled high despite the chill, his fingers reddened from effort. over near the quay. The river had frozen over just enough to allow the children to slide across its surface, their laughter carrying thinly through the crisp air. A few older men stood nearby, leaning on staves, debating whether the ice was strong enough for fishing holes yet. They spoke in the unhurried manner of those who had no urgent destination, their words punctuated by long pauses in which they simply watched the play of sunlight across the frosted reeds. The marketplace itself was quieter now than in the bustle of summer, yet still alive, with a different kind of energy. Bundles of herbs dried in late autumn hung from awnings, their brittle leaves releasing faint traces of scent whenever brushed by a passerby. Stalls offered coarse-woven mittens, clay jars sealed with beeswax, and strings of smoked fish whose skins gleamed faintly in the light. Now and then, a gust of wind carried with it the distinct aroma of hot broth simmering in a large pot at the edge of the square, luring the weary to pause and warm themselves with a wooden bowl in hand. Even the smallest movements here seemed purposeful, yet unhurried, as though the entire settlement understood that there was no sense in rushing against the measured pace of the season. The days might have been shorter, but in their brevity, they gathered a certain density, a quiet fullness that those in warmer climes could rarely comprehend. Each hour was layered with countless small acts of persistence. The careful mending of a garment, the stacking of firewood in neat rows, the deliberate stirring of a stew that would feed a household for 2 more nights. Beyond the last row of houses, where the settlement met the open fields, the snow stretched unbroken toward the dark line of distant forest. Here, one could stand and listen to the world in its slowest state, the soundscape reduced to the faint rustle of wind across the drifts and the occasional creak of ice deep beneath the ground. It was a stillness not of emptiness, but of a kind of quiet watchfulness, as though the land itself was conserving its strength, waiting for the slow wheel of the year to turn again. The winter of that year had been unusually long, pressing its pale weight over the valley far beyond the usual thaw. Even by the end of March, the narrow lanes between cottages were lined with ridges of stubborn snow, compacted by weeks of footsteps, wagon wheels, and the steady scraping of wooden shovels. Each morning, the earliest risers often the same, few individuals who kept the hearth embers alive through the night would step outside, their breath curling in the still air, to inspect whether the ice on the water barrels had thinned enough to break without splintering the wood. Most days, it had not. In such a season, the small domestic routines that might otherwise be unremarkable took on a weight of ceremony. Warming stones for beds, for example, was no longer simply an evening precaution against the chill, but a midday comfort as well. Housewives would set aside a portion of the day's embers to prepare a second set of warmed bricks or polished river stones, carried carefully in cloth wraps from the hearth to wherever family members were gathered indoors. Sometimes it was the elderly who received these extra warmers. Other times it was the youngest, kept bundled on benches near the kitchen, their little hands reaching out for the gentle heat. This habit, bringing warmth directly to where it was most needed, became a point of quiet pride in the community. Visitors noted that even the humblest households seemed to know the art of distributing heat efficiently. A family with little firewood left would place their warmer in a tightly woven basket, layered with wool scraps, so that it held its heat longer. The more resourceful among them even made small pockets in the basket lining, stuffed with dried moss or feathers, which acted as insulation. The practice, humble as it seemed, was passed along like a recipe, often explained in slow, deliberate detail over tea or during an idle afternoon by the loom. Of course, the village also had its share of inventive spirits who couldn't resist experimenting. A pair of brothers, whose father was the miller, once attempted to use the mill's grindstone to smooth the edges of their bed-warming bricks, claiming that this would make them safer to handle. What they hadn't accounted for was that the bricks would heat unevenly afterward, sometimes producing hairline cracks when placed too close to the coals. The incident became a gentle, cautionary tale, repeated with mild amusement whenever someone proposed improving upon a method that had worked for decades. Meanwhile, beyond the hearth, life's other rhythms continued. The baker's apprentice rose well before dawn to knead dough in the dim glow of an oil lamp, pausing occasionally to warm his hands over a small, flat iron plate kept near the oven. The blacksmith, whose forge never fully cooled even in winter, took to setting aside a few extra horseshoes just to trade with neighbors for cured meats or jars of pickled root vegetables. Such exchanges were not strictly necessary. Coin still had its place, but in those drawn-out winter months, the gesture itself was as important as the goods. Even the church, whose stone nave was the coldest place in the valley, adapted. Long benches were furnished with shared warmers on the most frigid Sundays, handed down the pews from one family to another. It was not unusual to see the vicar pause mid-sermon to pass along a heated stone to an elderly parishioner in the front row, all without breaking the calm rhythm of his words. In this way, warmth became not only a matter of comfort but also of shared duty, an unspoken agreement that no one should face the cold alone. As the days inched toward spring, a certain restlessness stirred in the air. Snowmelt began its slow trickle from the eaves, forming rivulets that sought out the dips in the cobblestone. Yet the nightly rituals of heating and carrying, wrapping and unwrapping, did not end abruptly. Instead, they lingered, perhaps out of habit, or perhaps because such acts had become part of the village's quiet identity. The knowledge of how to coax a single ember into lasting warmth, of how to pass it gently from hand to hand without losing its gift, would not vanish with the first green shoots in the fields. It would remain, a small thread in the broader fabric of their shared life, woven through seasons both harsh and mild. By the time the first frost of November began to cling to the window panes, the patterns of daily life in the town had shifted into their winter arrangement. The marketplace, once a bustling open square, where traders shouted over one another to attract customers, became a quieter affair. Merchants set up stalls beneath canvas awnings, heavy with condensation, and the smells of their goods, dried apples, salted fish, smoked sausages, and beeswax candles seemed to cling to the damp air. Shoppers arrived later in the day, reluctant to step out before the pale sun had thawed the cobblestones just enough to keep one's feet from slipping. The townsfolk had, by now, grown used to the shorter days. Oil lamps burned longer each evening, their yellow light softening the sharp edges of furniture and throwing faint shadows against plastered walls. Families gathered earlier indoors, with chairs drawn closer to the fire and the familiar sounds of spoons tapping against wooden bowls. Many used the extra hours to mend clothing, patching elbows on wool coats or reweaving the frayed ends of scarves, and to listen to the older members of the household recount tales from decades past. Some of these stories were local and ordinary, while others spoke of far-off places few here would ever see, told in such a way that they seemed both mythical and entirely possible. The blacksmith, whose forge usually rang well into the evening, began closing earlier. Instead of the rhythmic hammering, passers-by now heard the low creak of the workshop door and the muffled clank of tools being set aside for the night. The absence of the forge's orange glow meant that the street outside his shop grew darker sooner, and children returning from errands had to quicken their steps to keep ahead of the shadows. Up at the edge of town, where the last row of houses gave way to the gently sloping fields, the wind had taken on a sharper bite. Here, the hedgerows rattled dryly in the gusts, their leaves long gone, and the earth was firm underfoot. Shepherds walked the perimeter of their grazing plots with heavier cloaks drawn close, checking that the low wooden gates were secure. The animals themselves, sheep with thick, curling fleeces, and the occasional sturdy goat, moved more slowly. Now, their breath visible in the early dusk. The river that wound lazily past the mill had changed in mood as well. Where in summer it gurgled freely over shallow stones, it now flowed lower, with a darker hue, carrying the smell of wet reeds. The mill wheel still turned, but more slowly, and the sound it made a steady groan with each rotation seemed to carry further across the frosty air. The miller had taken to wearing thick leather gloves even indoors, for the chill clung to his hands long after he had stepped away from the river's edge. And yet, despite the season's austerity, there was a certain quiet contentment in the town. Work was steady, meals were warm, and the familiar cycle of preparing for winter had a reassuring rhythm. No one expected much to change from one day to the next. The pace was measured, unhurried, as though the town itself had settled into a long, slow breath, patiently waiting for whatever the deep winter months would bring. As the years passed, the townsfolk grew increasingly accustomed to the steady presence of the night watch patrols and the quiet murmur of oil lamps being tended along the main thoroughfare after dusk. These small, deliberate acts of vigilance were not born out of fear but of habit, rituals woven into the fabric of their evenings. In the workshops that flanked the market square, tradesmen often worked late into the night, their hammers and chisels striking softly against wood or metal, so as not to disturb the households nearby. Blacksmiths, in particular, were careful to draw their curtains and muffle the echo of their forges, knowing that even a single clang could carry far in the stillness of a winter night. During these hours, the baker's apprentice would step into the frosted air to check the heat of the bread ovens, lifting the iron lids with gloved hands and peering inside at the embers. The warm scent of leavening dough would drift into the alleyways, mingling with the crisp bite of cold air, and sometimes a passerby would pause to inhale deeply before continuing on their way. In these moments, the entire settlement seemed to exist in a state of half-dream awake, yet moving at the slow, unhurried pace of candlelight. The town's small watchtower, built of weathered stone and topped with a modest bell, stood at the southern gate. From there, the appointed night watchman would look out across the fields, his lantern casting a pale halo against the parapet wall. He was not so much guarding against danger as ensuring that the rhythms of the night remained undisturbed, that carts returned from neighboring villages without incident, that shepherds leading late flocks did so under the quiet assurance of a lit gate. When fog rolled in from the river, the sound of distant water lapping against the embankments was often the only reminder that beyond the walls, the world stretched on. It was also in these hours that certain unseen labors took place, tasks without glory, yet essential to the settlement's daily life. Stable hands would check the horses, replacing damp hay with fresh straw and running their palms over flanks to ensure no chill had crept in. Lantern repairers, often overlooked by the rest of the community, would move quietly from post to post, trimming wicks and topping up reservoirs, their satchels clinking faintly with glass and oil flasks. In the absence of bustle, the smallest of sounds seemed amplified: the soft click of a latch, the faint drip of water into a barrel, the creak of a signboard in the breeze. As the night deepened, household fires were banked low, their embers glowing like clusters of watchful eyes in the hearths. Families would settle into bed, layering quilts and woolen blankets to keep out the creeping chill. The youngest children, tucked tightly under the covers, would sometimes wake in the dim light to the sound of their elders' quiet breathing and the faint rustle of wind against the shutters. For them, this was the sound of safety, proof that the world, for now, remained still and unchanged. The rhythm of daily life in that part of the 18th century moved at a pace that would feel almost foreign to us now. Hours were not marked by the sharp precision of modern clocks, but by the slow drift of sunlight across familiar thresholds, the deepening tone of church bells, or the faint scent of bread wafting from a neighbor's oven at a certain time of day. In the homes of the village, morning light seeped in through wavy glass panes, each one slightly warped, bending the view outside into gentle ripples. The soft glow would fall upon polished oak tables, where, even before the day's work began, families might sit together for a small breakfast, perhaps a heel of bread from the night before. dipped in warm milk or sweetened with a little honey, if the season had been kind to the hives. The clink of tin spoons against ceramic bowls was often accompanied by conversations spoken in a low, unhurried way, for the mornings carried with them a kind of stillness that was not to be disturbed. One could step outside at such an hour and hear, not the chatter of markets or the clang of tools, but the far-off murmuring of the river and the occasional bleat of a goat tethered in a neighbor's yard. In the air, there was often a dampness that clung to wool coats and shawls, for the dew had yet to lift from the grass, and the scent of earth and wet leaves was strongest then. Those who kept livestock would tend to them quietly, moving about with practiced gestures, scattering feed for chickens, drawing water for the cows from the well, or checking the hooves of a donkey before the day's hauling. There was no rush, only the steady cadence of necessity. The animals, for their part, seemed to know the rhythm too. Hens scratched patiently at the dirt. A dairy cow might nuzzle the bucket with soft insistence, and the village cats, half wild, half domesticated, waited for the scraps they knew would come. In the distance, smoke began to curl lazily from a few chimneys, marking the slow awakening of hearths across the settlement. The smell of burning wood, seasoned over the summer and stacked neatly against outer walls, mixed with the faint aroma of herbs hung to dry in kitchens, thyme, sage, perhaps a little rosemary. Each home, though modest, had its own particular scent, a combination of stored food, wool blankets, hearth ash, and whatever stew or bread had last been prepared. As the morning wore on, the streets more like compacted dirt pathways than true roads would begin to see the first traces of human activity. A cartwheel rolling over uneven ground, a peddler carrying a small basket of goods from a nearby farm, children tasked with fetching water from the communal pump. At this time of year, boots and skirts would pick up damp traces of mud, leaving thin, streaky prints on the doorsteps they crossed. Even the work itself, once begun, unfolded in its own unhurried sequence. In workshops, wood shavings curled to the floor in silent heaps. Iron took on its slow transformation under the careful rhythm of the blacksmith's hammer, and loom weights clicked softly as a weaver adjusted threads for the day's weaving. It was the soundscape of an existence that valued endurance over haste, where the measure of a day's productivity was not how quickly it had been completed, but how well it had been tended. As evening fell, the streets of the town began to take on a different character. The clatter of hooves faded, the shouts of merchants softened, and the air grew still, except for the occasional murmur from a tavern doorway, or the low creak of shutters being drawn against the night. Light pooled in the windows of houses, flickering unsteady flames, casting silhouettes of figures moving slowly inside. The smell of smoke from hearth fires drifted down the lanes, carrying with it faint hints of stew, roasted root vegetables, and the sharp temps of freshly baked bread cooling on wooden boards. In the distance, a bell rang the hour in deliberate, unhurried tones, its sound rolling through the rooftops like a reminder that the day had yielded to the calm authority of the night. At the far edge of town, beyond the main square, a smaller cluster of cottages stood near the old mill. Here, life moved with a slower rhythm still. The mill wheel, now still in the dark, would begin its slow churn again at first light, when the river mist still clung to the stones, and the miller's boots left fresh tracks in the frost. Tonight, though, the river lay quiet its surface, a dark ribbon, broken only by the occasional ripple where fish stirred below. The only sound here was the gentle groan of wooden beams shifting in the cold and the distant hoot of an owl from the trees. Within one of these cottages, a family sat gathered near the fire, its glow warm against the walls of wattle and daub. The grandfather, his hands veined and knotted with age, was running his thumb over the edge of a worn wooden spoon as though it were a treasured relic. He spoke in a low, patient voice, telling a story so familiar that each member of the family could have recited it themselves. It was a tale about a winter long past so bitterly cold that the well had frozen solid, and the bread loaves had to be cut with a small axe. The children listened, wide-eyed, not so much for the story itself, but for the way his voice carried them into a past they could almost imagine but never truly know. Beyond the cottage, a narrow path wound toward the pasturelands, where shapes of sleeping livestock could just be made out in the gloom. The cattle, gathered close for warmth, gave off a faint, earthy smell, mingling with the sweet scent of dry hay. A single lantern swung gently on a post, casting long shadows across the frost-crusted grass. Somewhere out in the dark, a shepherd's dog gave a short, muffled bark before settling again. All around was the kind of silence that was not empty, but full of the small, steady sounds of a place at rest, breathing in its own quiet rhythm. The night sky above was unclouded, an expanse of black velvet, pierced by a scattering of stars, so sharp they seemed almost to tremble in the cold air. A pale moonlight silvered the edges of rooftops and fences, touching the cobblestones with a dim, ghostly sheen. Every so often, a faint breeze stirred, carrying with it the smell of damp stone and wood smoke. It was the kind of air that made people walk a little faster toward home, eager for the warmth of the hearth and the comfort of familiar voices. Yet not all was still. In the back rooms of certain houses, candles still burned late. The baker's apprentice was kneading dough for the morning, his hands moving in a slow, methodical rhythm while the yeast scent deepened around him. A weaver sat at her loom, feet pressing the treadles in a steady pattern, the threads building row upon row under her watchful eye. For these few, the night was not an end, but a time of quiet productivity, work done without the distraction of the day's bustle, accompanied only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Even the town watch, pacing along the old wall, felt this peculiar softness in the air. They carried their torches high, the flames painting the stone with shifting gold, and their boots struck the cobbles with a measured, unhurried cadence. There was no sense of urgency, here only the steady reassurance that, for this night at least, the town was safe under their watch. From their vantage point, they could see the surrounding fields fading into darkness, the faint lines of hedgerows barely visible against the pale shimmer of frost. Somewhere far beyond the edge of that darkness, the world moved on with its own concerns. Travelers on the road, merchants preparing for distant markets, letters making their way from one town to the next. But here, in this small corner, time seemed to fold in on itself. It was a night like many before it, and like many to come. The same bells would toll again tomorrow. The same fire would be kindled, the same path walked, the same hands at work. There was a quiet dignity in that repetition, a kind of comfort that could be felt, but not easily explained. And so the night deepened, wrapping itself more closely around the streets and the fields. Those still awake moved in low voices, those asleep shifted beneath blankets, and the town settled into a steady, even breathing until the first faint streaks of dawn would come to stir it all again. Yet beyond these daily and seasonal habits, there was a quieter, more reflective rhythm that shaped the lives of those who lived under the shadow of such laws. In the long winter evenings, when the wind hummed low and constant through the gaps in wooden shutters, people would gather around the central hearth and speak in unhurried voices about the laws that bound them, not in the manner of courtrooms or chieftains' halls, but in the way one might speak of the weather, inevitable, changing, and yet somehow always the same. The flicker of the firelight on their faces seemed to deepen the gravity of these talks, each shadow an orange glow painting them into silent witnesses of a centuries-old arrangement between ruler and ruled. The laws themselves were not written in books that the common folk could consult. They were remembered in the minds of elders, encoded in songs half sung during feasts, and passed on through the deliberate pauses and weighty inflections of storytellers. In the absence of ink and parchment for the many, memory was the archive, and the hearthside was the library. A certain old fisherman named Halvard was famed for his ability to recall not only the words of a ruling, but the exact circumstances under which it had been given, what the weather was that day, how the judge's beard was braided, and what sort of stew had been served in the hall afterwards. Children half asleep against their mother's knees would grow up hearing these details so often that they felt as real as the smell of smoke in their clothes. Such laws had a curious way of touching the smallest corners of life. A regulation about the times when fishing nets could be cast would ripple outward to influence when a family ate their first fresh catch of the season. A rule about the height of boundary fences meant to settle disputes between neighbors would alter the way a winter storm piled snow in the lane. Even the spacing of market days, fixed by old decree, dictated the rhythm of conversation in the tavern on market eve. Talk was hurried, full of lists and bargains yet to be struck. On the days after, it was slow and reflective, weighed down by the retelling of haggles won and lost. In this way, the laws became less an abstract set of instructions and more like the invisible frame around a painting. Few noticed them when they were sturdy and unchanging, yet everyone felt the jolt when they shifted, even by a little. The rare occasions when a new decree was announced brought a subtle tension to the air. Messengers would arrive, often travel-worn in muds, carrying the words from the assembly hall. People would lean forward as the scroll was unrolled, not so much for the announcement itself, which might concern something as small as the handling of stray goats, but for the way it signaled that the world was, in some small but undeniable way, about to be different. Those who enforced the laws in the villages were not faceless officials, but people known to all. They were farmers who had once tilled the same fields as their neighbors, fishermen who had shared the same storms. When they came to deliver a judgment, they carried with them not only the authority of the law, but the weight of a shared history. To refuse them outright would be unthinkable. To challenge them openly was to challenge the threads that kept the village whole. And yet, under the quiet hum of daily acceptance, there was always a subtle undercurrent, a space where personal opinion and private skepticism could live, unspoken but ever present in the corners of conversation and the silences between sentences. This delicate balance between the written and unwritten, the public and the private, was what gave the laws their true shape. It was not the scrolls or the assemblies that made them real, but the way they were lived, in the careful choice of words at a feast, in the timing of planting, in the decision to mend a net one day earlier than planned. Laws, in such a place, were not only about what was forbidden or allowed, they were about what was remembered, repeated, and quietly agreed upon in the glow of the hearth, when the night outside was deep and the snow began to fall. By the time the market bells began to chime in the pale morning air, the streets of the lower quarter were already stirring with a kind of slow, unhurried activity. Stalls were being set up under faded awnings patched with mismatched cloth, each one angled just so to catch the slanting sunlight. Wooden crates were dragged into place, the scrape of their undersides against the cobblestones creating a dry, rasping sound that echoed faintly between the walls. In the far corner, a pair of apprentices wrestled with a stubborn cartwheel that refused to align with its axle, the older of the two muttering in the local dialect about how things were made better in his father's day. The scent of the market was always the first true sign of the day's commerce. Warm loaves wrapped in coarse linen, cracked open to let out steam. Bundles of herb sage, rosemary, and tansy tied neatly with strips of dried reed. Barrels of salted fish, their briny perfume clinging to the air. These mingled with the sharper temps of fresh-cut leather and the faint metallic note of a blacksmith's forge nearby. Even those who had no coin to spend would drift through the aisles, breathing in the aromas, letting them serve as a reminder of the city's steady rhythm. Just beyond the main square, the taverns were waking as well. Their doors swung open, to reveal dim interiors still scented with last night's smoke and ale. Floors littered with a stray coin here, or a forgotten scarf there. Tavern keepers were a breed of archivists in their own way. They could recount who drank what, and with whom. what songs had been sung, and which visiting merchants had tried to pass off silver-plated trinkets as genuine work from the capital. These were places where the city's formal rules softened, where laughter came easily, and where news both true and half-invented traveled faster than any official courier. It was in these taverns that traveling musicians often found their audience. Some came with lutes or citterns, others with nothing more than their voice and a rhythmic tapping of the foot. A few sang old ballads of kings and battles, but most preferred the humbler songs, tales of millers who cheated the scales, of fishermen who claimed to have caught sea serpents, of sweethearts who met under the eaves of rain-soaked houses. The patrons would nod, smile, or groan in recognition, because, in one way or another, they had all known such characters themselves. Further down the narrow lanes, workshops hummed to life. In the potter's yard, the wheel spun under the steady pressure of a craftsman's foot, clay rising into graceful forms that would later be glazed in subdued greens and browns. The weaver's shutters were propped open to catch the daylight, revealing an interior where threads crisscrossed in taut, geometric patterns on the loom. Even the coopers, whose craft was often hidden behind closed doors, had their windows ajar so the rhythmic ring of the mallet could escape into the street, announcing the birth of yet another barrel or bucket. All these trades existed side by side, their proximity giving the city its distinct texture. A slip of conversation in the market might end up influencing a design in the weaver's shop. A tune played in a tavern could inspire the potter to carve a motif into the rim of a plate. And though the city's great hall and magistrates presided over its official governance, it was here in these quieter corners that the real pulse of life beat most steadily. As the afternoon wore on, sunlight softened into the kind of golden haze that seemed to rest on every tiled roof and wooden beam. Merchants leaned on their counters, speaking less urgently now, their early morning eagerness tempered by the knowledge that the day had found its pace. Children darted through the alleys with bundles of twine, inventing games whose rules changed as often as their laughter. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour, its toll rolling gently over the city like a slow wave. The rhythm was unremarkable, yet it was this very ordinariness that people trusted. In the predictability of the market's rise and fall, in the regular sweep of tavern doors opening and closing, they found something steady in a world where much else could change without warning. The summer of 1783 brought with it an unusual sort of quiet prosperity to the lowland villages along the marsh-lined coast. By then, the newly adopted sleep-time customs had become not merely domestic habits, but points of subtle pride. The marketplace, which was once purely a place for fishmongers and grain traders to ply their trade, now featured a scattering of small stalls selling items directly linked to evening comfort. A visitor could wander between burlap sacks of dried chamomile flowers, piles of well-cured juniper wood for slow-burning hearth fires, and neat stacks of linen nightcaps stitched with the initials of their intended owner. The air of the market in those late afternoons was warm, with the smell of drying herbs, and faintly salty from the sea breeze that rolled in at a gentle pace. Children darted through the narrow lanes, carrying errands for their mothers, a jug of warmed goat's milk to trade for a bundle of lavender, or a basket of duck eggs for a small clay jar of imported honey. Sleep, though still a private matter, had become woven into the very economy of the place. People spoke of their beds and bed-warming practices in the same way they might discuss a prized orchard or a healthy calf. One innkeeper, a widowed woman named Elspeth, found a steady income by offering not only lodgings, but also what she called night readiness services. For a modest coin, she would have a guest's bed, pre-warmed with a long-handled copper pan, filled with embers from her kitchen stove, and tucked between thick woolen sheets just before the guest retired. She insisted on using embers from alder wood, claiming they held their heat without releasing too much smoke. Travelers from distant inland towns often remarked that Elspeth's beds were the most welcoming they had ever known, and some even admitted to booking a night solely for the pleasure of the bed's initial warmth. In more prosperous homes, a separate small room, no larger than a cupboard, was sometimes reserved for the warming of bedding and night garments. Within these rooms, the air was kept hot by a central brazier, and blankets were hung from pegs until they radiated a gentle heat. Entering such a room was like stepping into the inside of a loaf just pulled from the oven, soft, close, and fragrant with whatever herbs had been scattered upon the coals that day. Sage was common in cooler months for its cleansing scent, while sweet woodruff or crushed rose petals might be used when guests were expected. The rhythm of the day itself shifted slightly in these years. Where once people might have lingered outside until darkness fully fell, now there was a gradual drawing in as the sun sank. Neighbors carried small horn lanterns to light their way, their amber glow moving in slow procession toward home. In the streets, the sound of shutters being drawn was followed by the muffled thud of thick drapes being pulled across windows. It was not so much a closing off from the world as it was a collective exhalation, the village settling itself for rest. The quietest hours, just before most had fallen asleep, belonged to the bakers and watchmen. The bakers worked in warmth, kneading dough in rooms lit by the steady pulse of their ovens, while the watchmen paced the cobblestone streets, their boots clicking softly, their breath visible in the lamplight. From the open windows of some homes drifted the gentle murmur of someone reading aloud a practice that had grown in popularity alongside the bed-warming trend. A single voice, low and steady, seemed to coax the household toward slumber. Even in the humblest cottages, the smallest tokens of this new sleep culture appeared. A single sprig of dried lavender tied with kitchen twine might be hung above a bed. An old quilt might be patched yet again, not merely to keep it serviceable, but to preserve its familiar weight, which the sleeper had come to trust. It was not the wealth of the object, but the intention behind it that mattered. In this way, the notion of preparing for sleep became as much about care and ritual as it was about physical comfort. The lantern light in the hall began to fade into a soft amber as the wicks burned lower, yet no one seemed eager to retire. It was in these quiet, late hours that the deepest matters of village life were discussed, not the loud proclamations of the day, but the slow, thoughtful negotiations that decided whether a new fence should be built along the sheep pasture, whether a narrow footbridge should be mended before winter ice claimed it, or whether the traveling tinsmith expected in the coming weeks should be offered a bed in the old loft rather than the drafty storehouse. Some men leaned back on their stools, turning their mugs absently between their fingers, eyes fixed not on the speaker, but on some distant thought. Others fiddled with the iron buckles of their belts or the knots in their cloak cords, as though their hands needed the reassurance of small work, while their minds wandered the landscapes of possibility. A faint crackle from the hearth punctuated the stillness, each ember shifting with the sigh of the old chimney. Outside, the night had deepened into a velvety blackness, the sort that swallows detail and forces the ear to take the lead where the eye can no longer guide. From the edge of the lane came the slow creak of the tavern's hanging sign, stirred by an idle gust that passed without urgency, as though the air itself had no wish to hurry anywhere. Somewhere beyond the wall, perhaps in the field behind the smithy, a restless horse gave a quiet snort and the muffled thud of a hoof against frozen ground. By the far window, an elder named Torvald, a man whose age was measured not in years, but in how many winter stories he could recount, drew his wool shawl closer. His voice was slow when he spoke, not because his breath failed him, but because he believed that haste made words brittle. "We must think on the river," he said at last, almost to himself. "The ice may hold now, but it will loosen soon. We cannot be caught with the ferry ropes frayed again." The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Men exchanged brief glances, and one or two murmured in agreement. It was the sort of topic that lingered, half practical concern, half omen. The ferry was not merely a means of crossing. It was a tether between the village and the wider world. If it failed at the wrong time, the loss of trade and messages could weigh on the community for weeks, even months. In the corner, near the stacked casks, young Corinne quietly swept errant crumbs from the floor with a broom whose bristles had worn thin at the tips. She moved slowly, not because she was idle, but because she understood that in these late hours, one did not interrupt the unspoken rhythm of thought. Her father, seated by the hearth, caught her eye and gave a faint nod, a gesture that meant she could close the broom cupboard when she was ready, but not before. Such was the silent language of the hall, where even the smallest acts were governed by centuries of unspoken custom. The talk turned then, almost naturally, to the coming thaw and the work it would demand. There would be the clearing of the mill stream, choked, as it often was, with winter branches and wind-blown straw. The millstones themselves, idle for much of the frost, would need to be turned slowly, by hand at first, their surfaces checked for chips, the great wooden cogs inspected for the season's wear. One man mentioned the last time they had found a dead branch lodged so firmly between the paddles of the water wheel that it had cracked under the strain. A story told not with excitement, but with the matter-of-factness of people who had lived long enough to expect such inconveniences. As the conversation wove between one memory and the next, the candles along the wall burned lower still, their wax pooling at the base in small uneven rings. The smell of tallow hung faintly in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of wool, cloaks and the faint metallic temps from the iron fittings of the stools. Even here, in the heart of the hall, there was the sense of the night pressing against the walls, patient and unhurried. It would not be long before the last few words were spoken. The benches scraped softly back, and the latch was drawn for the night. But for now, the hall breathed on, slow, deliberate, and utterly untroubled by the passage of time. As the late summer waned, the evening air in the village began to carry that subtle crispness which signaled the slow approach of autumn. It was not the kind of change that arrived suddenly, but rather one that crept in over several weeks, almost shy in its presence. The daylight hours still held warmth, but the shadows lengthened a little earlier each afternoon, and the scent of the earth shifted less of the sweet grass of midsummer, more of drying leaves and soil beginning to cool beneath the lengthening nights. In the hearths of certain households, fires began to burn in the evenings, not yet out of necessity, but for the comfort of familiar routines. In this transitional season, certain customs emerged that were tied to the rhythms of the year. Market days became livelier, with farmers and traders eager to sell their late-season produce before the chill made fresh greens scarce. The stall of the honey seller in particular drew many visitors. Her jars gleamed like captured sunlight in the slanting afternoon rays, and her beeswax candles, with their faint scent of summer fields, were purchased for the darker evenings ahead. A cobbler from a neighboring hamlet began visiting once a fortnight, setting up his bench beneath the great elm near the square. There, he mended boots and clogs, hammering nails into worn soles with a steady, almost meditative rhythm that blended with the background chatter of the crowd. Meanwhile, the blacksmith who had spent the warmer months repairing plowshares and cart axles now turned his attention to heavier tasks. He began forging iron hooks, hinges, and fire grates, knowing that the coming cold would require well-maintained hearths in every home. The ringing of his hammer became a more frequent sound, echoing over the rooftops in the stillness of the cooler air. Villagers would pause in their errands to watch him for a moment or two, perhaps to share a word about the weather or to exchange news of the next communal gathering. The evenings themselves grew quieter, yet not without their own small charms. Families would linger over the evening meal, talking in low voices, their words softened by the gentle light of tallow lamps. Children, no longer able to spend as much time outdoors before darkness fell, invented new games that could be played by the hearth. One favored pastime involved carving small figures from scraps of wood, clumsy in detail, but much loved for the way they could be moved about in imaginary dramas. Often, These figures would be painted with leftover pigment from a neighbor's workshop, their colors muted, yet cheerful in the dim firelight. There was also a change in the way the village prepared for rest. Bed linens were aired more thoroughly during the day, hung in the brief midday warmth, before being brought in again as soon as the shadows lengthened. Older folk took to checking the seals of their shutters more carefully at night, making sure that the cool drafts did not find their way inside on particularly clear evenings. The scent of wood smoke would mingle with the faint temps of distant marshland, carried on the breeze. It was a scent both sharp and comforting, and for those who had lived there all their lives, it signaled a return to the familiar cycle that had been repeated for generations. In these quiet, steady days, the village seemed to hold its breath, with tension, but with a kind of measured patience, as though everyone understood that the true labors of the colder months were still ahead. The fields, though stripped of their earlier abundance, still needed tending. There were roots to be dug, stores to be checked, and tools to be cleaned and put away. Even the smallest of these tasks was done without hurry, for there was a sense that each moment of preparation was as much about preserving tradition as it was about meeting practical needs. And so, in the measured pace of these days, life continued slow, deliberate, and without spectacled small action fitting into the larger tapestry of the year, as it always had, and as it always would. By the mid-afternoon, the wind had begun to shift, carrying with it the scent of damp earth from beyond the village boundary. It was not rain, not yet, but the unmistakable dampness of air that had crossed miles of open ground. In the market square, stall owners took note in their own ways. One woman began to roll her bolts of linen a little tighter. A man selling sugared almonds spread an extra layer of cloth over the trays, more to keep out the grit from the breeze than for any real threat of moisture. Even the pigeons, usually so intent on their erratic pecking between the stones, seemed to gather in closer knots beneath the shallow overhangs of the eaves. Life here had its own rhythm, dictated less by the hour on any clock, and more by the slow, almost imperceptible changes in light and sound. A wagoner, his shoulders wrapped in a thick, faded scarf, guided his mule past the apothecary's shop, the wheels of the cart tracing the familiar grooves, worn into the cobblestone by decades of similar journeys. The mule's hooves struck the stone with a hollow, deliberate pace, the sound mingling with the gentle creak of leather harnesses. From an open upper-floor window, the faint aroma of steeping herbs drifted outward, rosemary, mint, perhaps a trace of chamomile clinging in the cool air, before dispersing into the street. Across the way, children were still at play, though their games slowed whenever the wind grew stronger. One boy chased a wooden hoop with a stick, its rolling path wobbling dangerously each time the breeze caught it. Another crouched near a wall, trying to build a small pile of smooth pebbles, only for the occasional gust to scatter them into the gutter. A girl, her woolen shawl slipping from her shoulders, tried to coax a small, hesitant cat from beneath a bench, her voice soft and coaxing, the way older sisters often speak to younger siblings. The cat blinked at her with the patient suspicion of an animal well accustomed to the half-hearted offerings of children. The soundscape of the square shifted again when a pair of traders arrived from the outlying hamlets, their cart loaded with loosely stacked bundles of dried reeds and rushes. They moved slowly, as though unhurried by either time or competition, pausing to greet each familiar face. The reeds would be used for thatching, weaving mats, and sometimes for binding tasks that, in their own quiet way, marked the passing of seasons more clearly than any festival. Here, small necessities carried the weight of quiet tradition. Near the western edge of the square, beside a row of barrels that smelled faintly of apples gone soft, an old man sat on a stool, mending a wicker basket. His fingers moved with deliberate care, working the thin willow strips into place. Every so often, he would pause to push his cap back from his brow and glance up, not at anything in particular, but with the idle gaze of someone whose years had taught him the pleasure of stillness. The occasional passerby would nod to him, and he would nod back, neither party feeling the need for further exchange. Even as the afternoon light mellowed into a softer gold, the village seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation of anything momentous, but in that steady, unremarkable way that places do when the day has settled firmly into its second half. The shadows lengthened, but not dramatically. The air cooled slightly, but not enough to hasten anyone's pace. It was simply another day, unfolding at its measured pace, carrying with it the faint echoes of countless days before. And so, as the evening shadows stretch softly over the quiet settlement, the rhythms of the day dissolve into the stillness of night. The air cools, and the faintest scent of burning wood drifts from the hearths, mingling with the slow rhythmic creak of wooden shutters being drawn closed. Outside, the dirt pathways that only hours before were marked by busy footsteps now lie undisturbed, save for a cat pausing under a lantern's dim glow, tail swaying in unhurried arcs. Within the homes, conversations soften, becoming no more than a low murmur behind thick timber walls. A lone oil lamp flickers on a windowsill, casting gentle halos upon the uneven glass. Somewhere in the distance, a dog settles with a single sigh, curling into the hollow it has worn into the earth. It is in this stillness, when the last of the smoke fades into the pale sweep of moonlight, that the stories of the day are set down like folded garments, kept safe for tomorrow. The quiet is deep but not empty. It is full of small, steady things, the crackle of embers, the steady hum of the night insects, and the faint rustle of leaves swaying against the eaves. Here, time loosens its grip, and the mind drifts, finding comfort in the unremarkable yet enduring patterns of life. And perhaps, as your thoughts begin to drift with the rhythm of this place, the night will take you into its unbroken calm, carrying you gently toward rest.